Okay. Hi, welcome to Talkin' Sunday Readings. My name is Ann Carter. I am here again with Pastor Richard Stadler and with Father Chuck Carter, and we are discussing the lectionary readings that have been assigned for the second Sunday in Lent. We are still on year A, and the readings that we have chosen from several suggested readings. We decided to choose three so that we can talk about them in full. The Old Testament is Genesis 12, verses 1 through 4a. The epistle is from Romans, chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, and 13, verses 13 through 17. And the gospel is Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 through 28.
A reading from Genesis. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him.
The Old Testament lesson then from Genesis is the call to Abram. It is pretty famous, I think. It's kind of essential to our understanding of God's covenant with people. Abram, for those who need a little reminder, lived kind of in the Tigris-Euphrates area. His father was alive, they lived in the city of Ur, and then they moved north to Haran. From there, God asks Abram to leave, to go to Canaan, to settle. Abram has never, from what we know, he hasn't been there. He doesn't have a homestead there, but he says okay, and he leaves with Sarah, his wife, with his nephew Lot, with promises. God says, "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse." So wherever he goes, he is going to affect the people of God, because he will be the image of God to the world. He will, as we were created, he will reflect God to the world, and he will reflect the world back to God. And he will then be a blessing. It's a fascinating command to go into the unknown, and then with the promise that I'll be with you.
Well, and that's why.
So have a good trip.
Yeah, and Paul uses him then as a wonderful example of faith, and in the epistle lesson we'll see that. But and he was 75 years old at this time. I mean, his first move was from Mesopotamia to Haran, and then this move is from there into the Holy Land, but God doesn't tell him where he's going to, and he just says, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to give this all to you, this land," and it was occupied, and so he had to believe that God would somehow orchestrate that. And by the way, you're going to have lots of children. He doesn't have any children yet, haven't gotten started, and he's got a wife, but no children. So there's just a wonderful number of promises that God gives him that he just believes and accepts.
Yeah, there's a lot in the Old Testament about following. Obviously, Abram follows, and the children of Israel follow, and we're supposed to follow. I think that most of us now in our culture in the 21st century like to lead instead of following. We like to be the one who's in charge. We like to be the one who's creating the story rather than participating in somebody else's. But Abram just went.
And in the military tradition, the way you become a leader is you learn to first be a follower. And that's why every recruit is expected to do all the things that he's commanded to do, because that sets you up for becoming a leader. And we see that also among the patriarchs. And so, I mean, we can look at that in all three of the readings this week, I think. Does it show how faith follows God, even though there's no evidence to support the promises that God is giving at that moment. But he will keep his promises, and he does keep all his promises. They do. His descendants do take over the land.
So moving right to Romans, I think that's a pretty good segue.
A reading from Romans. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham our ancestor according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who, without works, trusts him to justify the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the inheritors of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of all of us, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. In the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist.
To you, Chuck.
Yeah, in Romans 4, verses 1 through 5 and verses 13 through 17, Paul expands on what we can learn from the story of Abram, the call of Abram. And he writes about this in the context of our own justification before God. He says that if Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So before Abraham starts off on this journey, he believes God. And that's where it begins. It's in the acceptance, the belief that God would be faithful to these promises he had made. It's this faith that enables him to set out from Haran into the land that God would show him. And then Paul has this interesting point that to the one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something else. That is, it's something that's been earned. But salvation, as Paul talks about it, is not something that is earned. It's something that is given to us as a gift by God. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. And so they're expanding on this sense that this isn't that salvation is not a quid pro quo. It's not something given in exchange for things we have done. Because in divine terms, there's nothing we can ever do that would be equivalent to what God has already done for us or continues to do for us. Rather, faith and salvation, that relationship, it's a gift. It's one of a gift, and we accept that gift or we reject that gift. And then in verses 13 through 17, he expands on this idea of how the law interacts with all of this. And of course, he's speaking to a Jewish audience. Well, not a Jewish audience, a mixed audience, Gentile and Jewish. And I think that's why he spends as much time as he does with the law and the interaction of the law and how the Gentiles fit into all that. And this point right here, it talks about that exactly. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null, and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. That is, what's the point of believing it if you can just simply obey something and it'll get you what you're after. God becomes a mechanism. Relationship with God in that case becomes a mechanism, rather than a call and obedience and faith and belief and a gift. It simply becomes a mechanism, if you will.
And when you look at the sequence of things in Genesis, he's given this promise in Genesis 12. God repeats it in Genesis 15, where again he says, it was reckoned to him for righteousness, his faith, because of his faith, it was reckoned to him for righteousness. He doesn't get around to doing anything to make himself obedient to God until Genesis 17, when God commands him now to get circumcised. And so all of these obedience acts of Abram are done after the promise has been given to him, and after twice it says he was accounted righteous. So he became righteous before he did anything. You know, he just believed. He did so, and that, what Paul's arguing here in the epistle is that's the way salvation works. That's the way we become declared righteous, because God has done something for us, and then he imputes that to us, and we receive it by faith. Now, does that mean that faith is all by itself? No. Faith is never alone. It also produces good works. And then the scriptures give us New Testament guidance as to how are you supposed to live now as a righteous person who's been made righteous by God. How is it supposed to show? And they give us all this guidance in the law. But
to think of it in the other way, that is that our works produce that righteousness. Well, you can do good things. You can spend your whole life doing good things and still be kind of a jerk, you know. Or have a mask of righteousness where you might do good things for certain people, but you lead a double life. You know, we can think of all kinds of possibilities in which the appearance of righteousness does not actually reflect true righteousness in one's heart and one's spirit. And so what God looks at is the heart, looks at what's within. And from within then produces what looks like righteousness on the outside.
Well, and if we remember where Paul came from, he came from Pharisees, and there was a Jewish tradition that even Gentiles could be righteous in God's sight by keeping the 7 Noahide laws. And they had these 7 laws that were specified by their tradition. And so a person could make themselves righteous, a tzaddik, by doing the law, whether it was the Noahide laws or whether it was the Mosaic law, but that's how he did it. And now Paul was raised that way, and that's what he taught as a Pharisaic rabbi. But now that he's come to know Jesus, he realizes the futility of that. I couldn't do that in a million years.
Sure.
And I've got to throw myself on the mercy of God. And now that will then produce fruits of faith. That faith will then augment your life as a righteous person. So.
The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me, my daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment.
So
Well,
to the
to
gospel, to Matthew.
lesson in Matthew 15:21-28, Jesus does a miracle outside of Israel. It's the only miracle we know of him doing outside of Israel, unless you consider the Decapolis area not Israel proper. And he goes into the region of Phoenicia by Tyre and Sidon, and this woman apparently has heard about him, and he goes into a home, and he's found. And we don't know if she's identified as a Canaanite woman. Now, does that mean she's a Canaanite who is converted to Judaism, or is she a Canaanite who just has heard about Jewish teachings and heard about how they have expectations of a Messiah coming, and she calls him by the term son of David, and she says, my daughter is severely demon possessed. Now, by this time, Jesus has already healed demon possessed people in Israel, and so the word must have gotten there that he's capable of doing that, and she asked him to help her, and he ignores her. Just silent. And it looks like he's being really rude. The disciples then say, dismiss her. You know? And I didn't think until preparing for this conversation, I've always assumed that they were just trying to do Jesus a favor. Okay,
Sure.
look, she's bringing way too much attention to us. You're trying to get away from the crowd. So just get rid of her, okay? But a number of commentators have observed that, no, there's another way of understanding that word dismiss. Heal her first, Lord, and then dismiss her. And I never thought about that possibility, but that certainly is possible. Because dismiss doesn't mean get rid of her. It means the word that's used here literally means to just send her away with no overtones or pejorative comments.
Okay.
And
Get rid of her.
So heal her and let's move on. Okay, he seems to respond by then saying, "Well, I've not been sent but to the lost sheep of Israel," and so that would agree with their invitation for him to get involved in healing her or her daughter, and then she comes to him and says, "Help me," and he makes this comment that sounds terribly abusive. He says, it's not proper to take the bread of the children and throw it to the dogs, and implying that she's a dog. Well, unfortunately, our translations don't do justice to the Greek, because the Greek term there is the diminutive form for the word dog, kunarios, and so it means little dogs, puppies. And in the ancient world, big dogs were not considered pets. They were guard dogs usually, and they were very vicious. And here in this context, she then picks up on that because of the term that he uses. And she says, yes, but even the little dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And a number of commentators have said, you know who the masters are, don't you? That's the children. And so the children are the masters of the puppies in their household, not the mom and the dad, but the kids, you know. And so it just opens up all kinds of nuances that I had never thought about before when looking at this story.
Interesting.
You know?
Yeah.
So, and then of course he heals her because he sees the faith she has and that she's attentive and she picks up on the clues that are given in the terms that she uses.
Interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is.
So, and her daughter was healed instantly.
Yeah.
He didn't even have to go there and touch her. He just did it from a distance. You know,
Interesting.
just marvelous. Anything else you see in here?
Well, I thought it was interesting that she came and she started shouting at him, which from my reading of Ken Bailey is what women could. They could stand outside and they could yell and they could make a fuss. But she didn't approach him until he invited her to, until he turned to talk to her. So she was persistent, and then when he turned and talked to her, then she came and knelt before him. So she was respectful of him, and she knew what he could do. She begged him for mercy, but she didn't suppose that he would, perhaps.
There's a little, the interaction between Jesus and this woman, I think it may be instructive in our own experience of faith as well, that you might not always get what you want when you ask for the first time. And there might, I think what Christ does is he helps bring this out of this woman, this deeper sense of faith that's within her, that maybe before she had this experience didn't realize she had. And I think perhaps in her own, this might be instructive and helpful for some of us too, that it might not always be the first time you ask for something that comes your way. There might be a lesson in your interaction with God that is waiting, that God wants to teach you in that moment. So.
And it might not be that he wants to teach you necessarily. He wants through you to teach someone else and then you reap the benefits. It can be all sorts of things that.
Well, and that's why her example is an example of the ministry of Jesus, that it's not just for the Jews. It also embraces the Gentile world. And so had he just done all of his miracles among Jews, it would not have reinforced what his church is going to preach when they go out to both Jews and Gentiles. Yeah. So some wonderful readings that we've got for this Sunday, and hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you did, please indicate so somehow. And I want to thank Tim Carter for being our editor, and ask that you come back and visit us again.